was Jacobus Capitein? Imagine being born into slavery on Africa's Gold Coast, only to become one of Europe's most educated theologians, preaching to white congregations in Holland and writing scholarly dissertations in Latin. Then picture returning to your homeland as a missionary, attempting to convert your own people to Christianity while defending the very system of slavery that once bound you. This is the paradoxical and haunting story of Jacobus Capitein, a man whose life embodied the most profound contradictions of the 18th century Atlantic world. This exploration examines one of the most enigmatic and troubling personalities of the colonial era, a man who was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, revolutionary and reactionary, whose story illuminates the devastating psychological impact of slavery and colonialism while raising uncomfortable questions about complicity, identity, and moral compromise in systems of oppression. Early life. From slavery to seminary. Jacobus Elisa Johannes Capitein was born around 1717 on the Gold Coast of West Africa, in what is now Ghana. As a young child, probably around age 7 or 8, Capitein was enslaved and sold to Dutch slave traders. The circumstances remain unclear, but they likely involved the complex web of warfare, kidnapping, and political conflict that characterized the slave trade's impact on West African societies. However, Capitein's fate took an unusual turn when he was purchased by Captain Arnold Steenhart, a Dutch sea captain. Rather than being transported to American plantations like millions of other Africans, Capitein was taken to the Netherlands around 1725. This decision would fundamentally alter his life's trajectory and create the contradictions that would define his existence. In the Netherlands, Capitein was given to the Van Gorck family, where he was treated more as an adopted child than a slave. The Van Gorck family, influenced by pietist Christian beliefs emphasizing personal salvation and missionary work, saw an opportunity to demonstrate Christian charity while potentially creating a missionary who could return to Africa. They ensured Capitein received an extensive education, something virtually unprecedented for someone of African descent in 18th century Europe. Capitein proved exceptional, quickly mastering Dutch and showing remarkable intellectual abilities. He enrolled in the Latin school in The Hague, studying classical languages, theology, and philosophy alongside Dutch elite children. His academic success was extraordinary. He not only kept pace with European peers but often excelled beyond them, demonstrating that intellectual capacity had nothing to do with racial background, though this lesson seemed lost on many contemporaries. Education and academic achievement. Capitein's educational journey represented both remarkable personal achievement and complex cultural colonization. At the Latin school, he immersed himself in European learning, studying Latin, Greek, Hebrew, theology, and philosophy. His teachers and patrons saw his success as validation of their civilizing mission, proof that Africans could be elevated through European education and Christian conversion. In 1735, at around age 18, Capitan entered Leiden University, one of Europe's most prestigious institutions. This was extraordinary for any young man of that era. But for someone born into slavery in Africa, it was virtually unprecedented. At Leiden, he studied theology under respected scholars, engaging with complex theological debates and philosophical questions that shaped European intellectual life. Capitein's academic work focused heavily on Reformed Protestant theology, the dominant religious tradition in the Netherlands. He wrote extensively in Latin, demonstrating mastery of classical rhetoric and theological argumentation. His professors praised his intellect and dedication, and he became something of a celebrity in Dutch intellectual circles, a living example of what European education could supposedly achieve. However, this educational process also involved profound psychological transformation with lasting consequences. Capitein was taught to see Africa through European eyes, as a continent mired in heathenism, barbarism, and spiritual darkness, needing European intervention. He internalized many racial prejudices and cultural assumptions of his adoptive society, learning to view his own background with shame and missionary zeal. The culmination of Capitein's formal education came in 1742 when he completed his theological dissertation at Leiden University, titled Political Theological Dissertation on Slavery. As not contrary to Christian freedom, this work would become one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. In it, he argued that slavery was compatible with Christian doctrine, using biblical texts and theological reasoning to defend the institution that had originally enslaved him. The controversial dissertation, Defending Slavery, Capitein's 1742 dissertation, represents one of the most morally complex and psychologically troubling documents of the 18th century. Writing in scholarly Latin for European theologians and intellectuals, he systematically argued that slavery was not incompatible with Christian freedom. Using biblical precedents and theological reasoning to defend an institution with profound personal significance, the dissertation drew heavily on biblical passages that seemed to accept or regulate slavery rather than condemn it outright. Capitan pointed to New Testament letters instructing slaves to obey masters and masters to treat slaves fairly, arguing that Christianity transformed enslaved people's spiritual condition without necessarily changing temporal circumstances. He contended that physical slavery could coexist with spiritual freedom, and that enslaved Christians could achieve salvation regardless of worldly condition. Coming from someone who had personally experienced enslavement, these arguments carried particular weight and generated considerable attention throughout Europe. Supporters of the slave trade seized upon his work as validation from an African scholar, while critics were horrified by what they saw as intellectual justification for brutal oppression. The psychological motivations behind this dissertation remain deeply troubling. Some historians suggest Capitan was attempting to reconcile traumatic experiences with adopted Christian faith, finding ways to make sense of suffering through theological frameworks. Others argue he was demonstrating complete assimilation into European intellectual culture by defending his adoptive society's interests against his birth community. The dissertation reveals how education and acculturation could become forms of psychological colonization. Capitan had learned to think like his European teachers, accepting their assumptions about African inferiority and European superiority. His defense of slavery represented not just intellectual argument, but internalized oppression, the process by which oppressed groups adopt their oppressors' worldview. Return to Africa, the mission years. After completing his education and ordination as a Dutch Reformed Church minister, Capitan faced a defining choice. He could remain in the Netherlands, where he had achieved remarkable success despite his African origins, or return to the Gold Coast as a Christian missionary. In 1742, he chose to return to Africa, a decision that would prove personally and professionally devastating. The Dutch West India Company supported Capitan's mission as part of their broader colonial strategy, seeing potential value in an European-educated minister who could serve both the Dutch colonial community and potentially convert African populations. However, their support came with expectations and limitations that would constrain his work. Capitan arrived at Elmina Castle, the massive slave-trading fortress on the Gold Coast, in 1742. The irony was immediately apparent. He was returning as a representative of the very system that had enslaved him, tasked with spreading his former captor's religion among his own people. The psychological weight of this contradiction would prove increasingly difficult to bear. His mission faced immediate challenges from multiple directions. Dutch colonial authorities were suspicious of his potential influence among African populations and worried that his education might inspire dangerous ideas about equality. They insisted he focus primarily on ministering to Dutch personnel rather than large-scale African conversion efforts. African communities were often skeptical of Capitan's message and mission. Many viewed him as a traitor who had abandoned his people to serve their oppressors. His European education and Christian beliefs marked him as culturally foreign, while his defense of slavery made him morally suspect. The complex landscape of traditional African beliefs, Islamic influences, and competing European colonial interests provided little fertile ground for his missionary efforts. Challenges and contradictions in colonial Ghana. Capitan's years in colonial Ghana exposed the fundamental contradictions inherent in his position and mission. As an educated African working within the colonial system, he occupied a liminal space that satisfied neither European authorities nor African communities. His attempts to navigate these competing demands revealed the impossible nature of his situation. The Dutch colonial establishment at Elmina Castle represented everything brutal and exploitative about European presence in Africa. The castles served as a major slave trade hub, with thousands of Africans imprisoned in its dungeons before shipment to American plantations. Capitan found himself ministering to Dutch officials and soldiers directly involved in enslaving and brutalizing African peoples, potentially including members of his own ethnic group. His sermons to Dutch audiences had to carefully navigate moral tensions. He could preach about Christian charity and brotherly love while surrounded by slavery and exploitation machinery. His theological training provided sophisticated ways to rationalize these contradictions, but the psychological cost of maintaining such cognitive dissonance was enormous. Capitein's attempts to establish educational institutions for African children met with limited success and considerable opposition. Dutch authorities were suspicious of efforts that might educate Africans too extensively, fearing education could inspire resistance. African communities had valid reasons for skepticism, seeing that European-style education often involved cultural alienation and preparation for subordinate colonial roles. The climate and disease environment posed additional challenges for Capitan, whose European years had not prepared him for tropical life realities. His health began deteriorating, adding physical suffering to psychological and spiritual struggles. Legacy and historical assessment. Jacobus Capitein died in 1747, just 5 years after returning to Africa, at approximately age 30. His death marked the end of one of history's most psychologically complex and morally troubling careers. The legacy he left continues generating debate among historians, theologians, and African diaspora scholars. From one perspective, Capitein's life represents remarkable achievement against overwhelming odds. Born into slavery, he achieved educational and intellectual recognition virtually unprecedented for Africans in 18th-century Europe. His academic success demonstrated African intellectual capacity, when European racial theories increasingly denied such possibilities. However, the uses to which Capitain put his education raised profound moral questions about complicity and resistance under oppression. His defense of slavery provided intellectual ammunition for those profiting from human bondage, potentially prolonging millions of Africans' suffering. His missionary role served colonial interests by spreading European cultural and religious values, justifying political and economic domination. Modern scholars approach Capitein's legacy with considerable complexity, recognizing both individual achievements and structural forces shaping his choices. Some view him as a victim of psychological colonization, someone whose traumatic experiences and subsequent acculturation made clear identity or moral direction impossible. Others see him as a conscious collaborator, choosing personal advancement over solidarity with oppressed Africans. The concept of internalized oppression provides one framework for understanding Capitein's career. His defense of slavery and embrace of European cultural superiority can be understood as extreme examples of psychological adaptation to powerlessness. How oppressed groups often adopt oppressors' values as survival mechanisms. Psychological and cultural analysis. Understanding Jacobus Capitein requires examining the psychological trauma and cultural displacement that shaped his worldview and choices. His life provides a case study in how oppressive systems can psychologically colonize their victims, turning them into unwitting agents of their own community's subjugation. The process began with childhood enslavement and removal from Africa. This traumatic separation from family, community, and cultural identity created what psychologists now recognize as complex trauma, deep psychological wounds affecting personality development and worldview formation. Young Capitain learned that survival depended on adapting to European expectations and values. His Dutch education, while providing intellectual opportunities, also involved systematic cultural indoctrination. He learned to see Africa through European eyes as a continent of darkness, barbarism, and spiritual poverty. This educational process required internalizing negative views of his origins while embracing his adoptive society's culture. The psychological cost was enormous, involving suppressing his original identity in favor of a European-constructed self. His theological training provided sophisticated frameworks for rationalizing his complex position, but also deepened his psychological colonization. Christian doctrine, as taught in European institutions, emphasized submission to authority, acceptance of suffering, and spiritual rather than temporal liberation. These teachings could justify almost any social arrangement, including slavery, by focusing on otherworldly rewards rather than worldly justice. Modern relevance and lessons. Jacobus Capitein's story remains deeply relevant to contemporary discussions about identity, assimilation, resistance, and complicity under oppression. His life provides insights into psychological processes that continue affecting individuals and communities dealing with colonialism, racism, and cultural domination. The concept of internalized oppression, illustrated dramatically in Capitein's career, helps explain how oppressive systems maintain themselves through psychological as well as physical violence. When oppressed group members adopt their oppressors' perspectives and values, they become unwitting agents in their own community's subjugation. Capitein's story also illuminates individual advancements, limitations as a strategy for addressing systemic oppression. His remarkable personal achievements did nothing to challenge broader slavery and colonialism systems. If anything, they provided intellectual justification. His example demonstrates how exceptional cases can deflect attention from structural injustices, while providing false hope that individual merit alone can overcome systematic discrimination. The role of education in Capitein's story raises important questions about cultural transmission and identity formation. His European education, while providing intellectual tools and opportunities, also involved cultural alienation and psychological violence. Contemporary debates about culturally responsive education, decolonizing curricula, and maintaining cultural identity within dominant educational systems echo the dilemmas faced by Capitain and his patrons. The enduring questions. Jacobus Capitein's life poses enduring questions about moral responsibility, cultural identity, and resistance under oppression that remain relevant across centuries and contexts. His story refuses easy categorization as either heroic achievement or moral failure, instead embodying the complex realities of survival and adaptation within brutal historical circumstances. How do we judge someone who was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, someone whose personal achievements came at moral compromise's cost? Capitein's defense of slavery represents one of history's most troubling examples of intellectual collaboration with oppression, yet it emerged from psychological wounds inflicted by the very system he defended. His story also raises questions about freedom and agency's nature under oppressive systems. Was Capitain truly free to make different choices, given his psychological colonization and dependence on European institutions? These questions remain relevant for anyone navigating systems of oppression and inequality. The tension between individual advancement and collective liberation that characterized Capitein's life continues challenging marginalized communities today. When does personal success become complicity with oppression? How can individuals maintain cultural identity and community solidarity while engaging with dominant institutions? The complex verdict. Jacobus Capitein remains one of history's most troubling and paradoxical figures. A man whose life embodied slavery and colonialism's psychological violence while demonstrating both the potential and dangers of individual achievement within oppressive systems. His story defies simple moral judgments, instead demanding that we grapple with the complex ways trauma, education, and cultural displacement can shape human choices and identity. Perhaps the most important lesson from Capitein's life is recognizing that oppressive systems damage not only their direct victims but also those who appear to benefit from them. His psychological colonization and moral compromise illustrate how slavery and colonialism corrupted everyone they touched, creating tragic figures who became unwitting agents in their own community's oppression. Understanding Capitain requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. He was both victim and perpetrator, achiever and collaborator, African and European, enslaved and free. His story reminds us that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation and achievement even under the most difficult circumstances, but also that such adaptation often comes at terrible psychological and moral costs. The questions his life raises about identity, complicity, and resistance remain as urgent today as they were 3 centuries ago. Jacobus Capitein's story isn't just about one man's tragic choices in the 18th century. It's about understanding how oppressive systems shape human psychology and moral reasoning in ways that continue influencing our world